Hello and welcome to this video on why hormones rage, or as it might be better known, that period called puberty where you wish to forget anything and everything awkward. And the reality is that most people don't have a great understanding of the interactions and actions of hormones throughout the body, and not just throughout puberty but in other instances. For example, the role they might play in things like prostate cancer or breast cancer. So we thought it'd be a good idea to start with this very basic video on what hormones are, and rather less facetiously, raging hormones. The reality is that raging hormones are the confluence of both hormones and emotions during puberty and later in life when middle-aged men with very small penises and weak wills abuse steroids to try and make up for their shortcomings with a very toned physique. For this video, we'll focus on the much more common pubescence than mediocrity and insecurity. Both sexes will undergo massive hormonal changes in puberty, but female changes are much more elastic due to the ovulation cycle and hormones that change during. To that end, let's start with what makes this as simple as it can be. Males, particularly as they're more basic, but the same processes are present in females, particularly when we talk about feedback loops. During puberty, males will have increased production of a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is released from the hypothalamus, or brain structure responsible for either directly or indirectly regulating most hormones in your body. This flows into the anterior pituitary. In response to that, the pituitary releases two hormones: follicle-stimulating hormone, often abbreviated to FSH, and leutenising hormone, often abbreviated to LH. The first, follicle-stimulating hormone, goes to the testes, but it specifically goes to the Sertoli cells, which facilitate sperm production. Leutenising hormone goes to the testes, but is received by the Leydig cells. These increase Sertoli cell function and therefore improve sperm production. This is a positive feedback loop. More luteinizing hormone going to the testes and activating the Leydig cells, the more activation you have Sertoli cells and therefore more sperm. The caveat to this is that both follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone have a negative feedback on both the hypothalamus and pituitary through their target cells. The Leydig cells make testosterone. This tells the hypothalamus to reduce gonadotropin-releasing hormone production, and it tells the anterior pituitary to reduce follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The Sertoli cells produce inhibin. This reduces the follicle-stimulating hormone production and luteinizing hormone production from the anterior pituitary. It is a sort of tug-of-war between the hypothalamus and testes. When one gets stronger, it sends a signal to the other to slow down. Where this gets important for males, and why it leads to rage, is that when luteinizing hormone is not well regulated, such as during puberty, it can lead to an increase in testosterone. The increase with, let's say, a lack of regulation, or it might be more accurate to say it gets ignored by the hypothalamus and pituitary. Because of this, they are unable to stop the production of luteinizing hormone, so testosterone levels will rise, to a certain extent. The higher or elevated levels of testosterone in this case lead to greater regression and emotional outbursts. However, unlike exogenous or steroid based on testosterone, it does not negatively affect the testes. This means that everything keeps working even when it seems to be going crazy. The body does eventually reach a point of equilibrium, and throughout most of a male's life, their testosterone production will be relatively stable. Now for the complex scenario, females, where males have a relatively simple system called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. This involves the hypothalamus, pituitary, and testes. In females, it involves the hypothalamus, pituitary, ovaries, and uterus. While only one extra organ, it is part of a constantly shifting set of parameters, and that makes it much harder to put the pin on any one particular thing. Like in males, it will start with the hypothalamus, sending out gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This goes into the pituitary. From here, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are released. These travel to the ovaries first. In the ovaries, they trigger the follicle or pre-ovum to grow and develop. Luteinizing hormone eventually peaks to initiate release of the ovum, or a release of an egg. As it grows, it releases more and more estrogen. In the days immediately before ovulation, the developing follicle also secretes more and more progesterone. This peaks about a week after ovulation. Further to this, inhibin is produced at ovulation to prevent subsequent ovulation and allow pregnancy to become established if fertilization occurs. This situation now has 5 hormones circulating, 2 different structures, the uterus and ovaries, that are both going to make hormones at various times, as well as the pituitary and hypothalamus. It is a lot of feedback loops and a lot of intersecting systems. For most purposes, we can split hormones into gonadotropins and ovarian. Of the gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are there to make the ovarian cycle follow through a predictable pattern. This leads to a predictable release of estrogen during the menstrual cycle. That is great once you reach adulthood. The problem is adolescence, where many of these rules are not followed. During adolescence, the negative feedback loop is nowhere near as effective. This leads to the increased estrogen from the developing ovum not downregulating follicle-stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. This is done not by downregulating these hormones, but by the hypothalamus not being responsive to the increase in estrogen. This leads to rising luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone levels, because it is not downregulated and it causes a sustained increase. The sustained rise in these hormones leads to emotional and physical changes. Not only that, but you also have a sustained increase in estrogen levels, since you continue to see that the follicle-stimulating hormone has follicles growing and developing, therefore leading to increased estrogen production. During adolescence, some if not many of the normal rules get broken, but specifically secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone by the hypothalamus should be inhibited by estrogen, and particularly low levels. But in this case, it gets stimulated by the high levels of estradiol, which is one of the estrogen hormones. In theory, when the hypothalamic pituitary gonadotropin axis is working, it should allow the increased effect of the ovarian hormones to be countered by gonadotropins. As we established, this does not happen. This then leads us to the follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, but specifically, that the follicle cells that get stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone should be making inhibin. Inhibin should then reduce follicle-stimulating hormone production. This is an ovarian hormone though. Since we get release of inhibin, you get a reduction in follicle-stimulating hormone, at least temporarily. This is meant to prevent the development of follicles. If they're blocked from developing, estrogen would also be blocked. Since there's no signal release from an ovum, and even if there was, it's not mature, the ovum cannot release, therefore it doesn't happen. But that doesn't prevent other follicles from being stimulated to grow by follicle-stimulating hormone. This leads to a situation in which you don't get progesterone being produced, because that is a consequence of the follicle releasing the ovum. That in turn leads to the follicle-stimulating hormone being upregulated, due to a lack of negative feedback rather than a positive feedback loop. It's somewhat along the lines of it's better to beg forgiveness and ask permission when it comes to regulating hormones this way. By that we mean that the hormones will do what they're supposed to do unless they get told otherwise, and they don't really have the kind of feedback mechanism that allows them to be stopped unless there's something telling the body to stop them. Despite this, the female body is trying to ovulate or continue the cycle of things should happen but is not, and so this means that the hormones continue to try and get produced. This causes increases in various hormones, and then more hormones again trying to counteract this and prevent it from happening. And that breaks all of the standard rules in the female body when it comes to what should inhibit or promote production of hormones. As you can see, the raging sex hormones quip is not just a quip, at least in most instances. It's the fact that none of them are doing what they're supposed to do, and they're all running amok. At least for males, it's a little bit easier to figure out what's going on, as you have a fairly straightforward diagram. Females gets messy very quickly, but again, you have a lot of moving parts at different times of the month, and that's what makes it very difficult to figure out exactly which of these is upregulating, downregulating, or not even related to others. Hopefully, these two images will make it much easier for you to understand what's happening, and get your head around just why hormones are raging. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.